Hey guys, welcome back. BDCKR here. We're back with Season 8, Episode 13 of our weekly Q&A videos. If you're currently on YouTube right now and you want to listen to this in podcast format on a bunch of different podcasting apps, you can check those out by checking the links in the description. Or you can stay here if you want. I'm not, your parent. I can't tell you what to do. But you might want to. It's kind of fun. I like listening to stuff as podcasts better than I like YouTube videos as a general rule of thumb.
Okay, I am your parent, and I can tell you what to do, but it's not like you're necessarily going to listen either.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to listen to us as a podcast. It's me talking.
Yeah.
I don't need to hear myself again. I don't even really need to hear myself the first time. But anyways, starting off, we like to give sort of little bits of updates. This is our opportunity to just talk about what's been going on for the week. So, obviously, I was not here last week because I was in the middle of exam season and I was busy writing or studying for an exam. At the time that it was last week was going to be recorded, I wasn't writing an exam at that exact moment, but I was studying for one.
Right.
And now I'm finally done and I'm free.
Congratulations. So how do you think you did?
I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah,
I've gotten a couple of my marks back. I've actually already gotten 2 back out of 4. And not too bad so far.
Very good.
Fingers crossed it stays
Well
that way.
done.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing, which is now with my free time, I'm playing the new Cyberpunk, which I think there's a lot going on with Cyberpunk in general. There's sort of a lot of attention on it right now within gaming.
Yeah, and not, even outside of gaming, because I'm not a gamer. I'm aware of it because I've been seeing ads for it on TV.
Yeah.
And I saw an article about it in the newspaper where I think the company has been having some troubles because it doesn't perform well enough on current iterations of gaming consoles.
Yeah, so CD Projekt Red had a big stock drop after the game came out. And it performs really terribly, actually, I think, on a lot of consoles. And it's interesting because I have a gaming computer, and I have a pretty good gaming computer. It's a couple years not refreshed now. I made it partway through first
So
year.
when you say good gaming computer, you want to give some sort of context?
Yeah, it has a 1080 for the graphics card, and it's all sort of that approximate standard. So it's not like a TI, but it was good when I bought it about 2 years ago at this point, and it was pretty close to top of the line. Not quite top of the line, but it was like it was right on that edge where things were all, like the components were all relatively expensive for it, but it was to that sort of edge of really good, but not past the point of diminishing returns. We're getting a little bit more performance out of it for a lot more money.
So when you're talking about gaming computer, you mentioned one thing, the graphics card, right? So
yeah.
That's part of the definition. I think the processor matters.
Yeah.
And the hard drive matters some. That if you're working with an SSD, it's going to be faster.
Yeah,
right?
I'm playing Cyberpunk off the SSD,
and you need a significant amount of RAM. There's a threshold below which it's going to be the choking point, right?
Yeah. And so I can run it. But even I'm not getting 60 frames consistently on, like, I think high graphics quality.
Right.
So it is really beefy, and even like just the way that it's loading in textures and stuff is not 100% optimized, because that's the thing about the game, is that there's games that are a lot tighter experiences, like the video game Prey. I found really
tighter experience meaning
like, so this game is an open world.
Okay.
There's a bunch of stuff going on. There's a huge amount of assets. It's a larger space, and you're doing stuff like driving around through it, right? Where you're going through a bunch of new stuff at a relatively quick clip, and it's built such that you don't need to do very much loading at all, where you can just drive from like one end of the city to the other, right? And theoretically, have it all show up in front of you. And so the problem is that they have to do all those loading and unloading tricks that video games have to do more, where they have to be able to process a bunch, like a huge world, pretty on the fly, right? As you're moving from one place to another, as you have a bunch of, people in the city, some enemies, right? Different factions. It has to keep track of a bunch of stuff. So it's a really pretty game overall, but for that sort of beauty, it, I think, suffers a little bit for its performance and for how sort of big and for like how just massive it is as a project. I think there's been a lot of places where you can't optimize it to both look absolutely gorgeous and run super, super well. And I don't know how much better they could have made it, right? Like, that's not my area of expertise. But, you know, I've played a game like Prey, for example, which has not the same aesthetic, but a similar aesthetic, where it's sort of like space futuristic. Lots of like glass and mirrors, and there was like a whole sort of visual mechanic with it for like a piece of technology that's like mapping 3D spaces onto what's called a looking glass, which is almost like it's like a 3D TV rendered in the game that you can actually break the glass on and see it like rendered through like shards of glass, which looks really cool. Anyway, the point is that like sort of my closest point of comparison that I think for something that has a vaguely similar style, does a lot of really interesting visual stuff and looks really good. I could run on my laptop from even a couple years before, because it's such a tight contained experience. There's only a certain amount of areas. There isn't like new stuff popping up. There's a low amount of AI. It's not processing as much at once. So Cyberpunk, a game which is so big and has all that bloat, I think really has some more trouble with performance. And we've seen that because, you know, a lot of the consoles that you're supposed to be able to get it on, it really is not performing to a standard of quality that is particularly playable.
So they're offering a lot. It sounds like what you're saying is they're offering a lot in terms of the potential experience, but it comes at a huge cost.
Yeah. And so I think one of the things, I'm quite enjoying the game. I'm going to say that first
because
off.
you can.
Yeah, because I can.
Right.
But there is a certain, I want to say, lack of polish to it, where one of the things that I'm experiencing a bunch is I will kill or knock out, I'll take down an enemy, and their AI does not recognize the fact that I've taken them down. I'm not allowed to loot their body. I'm not allowed to take stuff from their body, which you can do to anybody who you've killed. Like any enemy that you've killed you should be able to do that. And they will continue speaking to me as a corpse. They'll do those like vocal barks that like kind of, I'm gonna get you type thing that they'll have enemies do to make it feel more sort of realistic, where they're like, you got a guy over there, right? Got eyes on the target, or that kind of whatever stuff. And so there will be a man on the ground, and when you do the scanner to check if there's loot, they'll show up as like a lootable like container. But they will not let me take items from them, and they will yell about how I'm in the area and how they're going to shoot me as they lay there dead or supposedly dead or unconscious on the ground. So there's little stuff like that.
So maybe it's a glitch in the Matrix.
Yeah, that's the one fun thing about it, is that like Cyberpunk is so heavily invested in its own like tech stuff, and everybody's like augmented it with tech stuff, that you can almost explain it away in universe as just like tech things glitching out, and it doesn't, like, to me, make the experience not fun. But like one of the things that happens a lot that is genuinely challenging is if I pause by accident while I am hitting a move key. So Shift Tab for me opens my Steam menu for like chatting with people and stuff, and Tab is the scan function in the game. I have to press Tab, and Shift is the sprint function. So if I'm running by something and then I decide, I want to scan, I'll hit Shift Tab. But I'll hit them at the same time, and what that will do is it'll open up my Steam menu, and it'll automatically pause the game. And then when I close my Steam menu and unpause the game, a not insignificant portion of the time, I am now stuck always moving in whatever direction I was moving when I Shift Tabbed. So I can't like stop moving forward, for example, no matter what I do. And so now I can no longer move backwards at all. I can only move forward. I'll move forward no matter what's happening. And if I press the back key, those two actions will cancel each other out, and I'll stay exactly stationary. And then I can only strafe left and right. Okay,
so it's like when you're in the old days when your joystick would get out of alignment.
Yeah, and it would be like stuck in a position. Yeah, so there's stuff like that. Looting people has already been hard. I can't get items just in general. Sometimes it'll show me that there's an item that's supposed to be on like a table, and it'll be like either sitting above the table a little bit or in the table, and there's some like times where I'm like looking at something that I know I'm supposed to be able to pick up, and it's not bringing up the menu to pick it up, and so I'm just sort of staring at something that I'm supposed to grab, and I do not have access to it. So there's a bunch of sort of little stuff like that makes the game slightly harder to get fully immersed in, right? It's sort of like a qualified enjoyment of it, but other than that, I am finding the game pretty good. So that's that's my review of Cyberpunk right now, and I'm not very far in it at all. For context, I've only just gone past the title screen. Like, not the title screen, but like there's you
so
get
the intro, the story,
you get to a certain part of the game,
yeah.
and then it shows like Cyberpunk 2077, right? Not so I don't know what that's called, like the opening card, something, whatever. But whatever that is, and that happens like I don't know, it happens a couple hours into the game. But I've been doing a bunch of side quests and stuff. Well, one of the other things with Cyberpunk is that I think the game is supposed to be about 40 hours for the main quest.
Yeah.
So it's relatively long. And so in their marketing, they wanted to show people stuff. So they had a bunch of gameplay, they had a bunch of stuff. And the stuff that they showed off was mostly from like that before the intro card. That couple hours into the game. So I knew actually about the characters. I had seen footage with it, and I had seen some of like the gameplay sections that I played through. In like their demos or whatever. I wasn't super into all the marketing and everything, but just sort of passively, I know I engaged with a lot of it. And one of the things that like is almost sort of the reveal that you get right as that like card is coming up, like the direction that everything is moving.
Do we need to warn people about spoilers?
No, I'm not going to spoil it.
Okay.
I'm not going to say anything.
Right.
Is pretty heavily spoiled in the marketing for it.
Okay.
Is what I'm saying. So you're playing it and you know about something. This will be a spoiler if you haven't seen any Cyberpunk stuff, but you know, if you've seen almost any of the marketing for it, that Keanu Reeves is in it,
right?
And that he features pretty heavily in at least all the marketing.
Yes.
And so until you hit that title card, Keanu Reeves has not shown up at all, and so you know Keanu Reeves is showing up. Right. So the stuff that the sort of marketing has not necessarily spoiled, but that you've gotten a lot of sort of extra information about that if you're just going in blind you would not have, is up to that sort of the end of that introduction, and then you know at some point that Keanu Reeves shows up and he has not shown up yet, so you're sort of also waiting for that eventuality. That's
interesting. So it's funny to me because clearly there's a long I never thought I'd say there's a long tradition of Cyberpunk.
Yeah.
That it started. I mean, Matrix is really in that tradition, right?
Yeah.
But Cyberpunk, I think, really started with William Gibson's Neuromancer back in the early 80s. I've got a copy of that on the shelf right here.
Yeah,
but
it did.
It's amazing to me that like almost 40 years later, it still has life as not a historical thing, but there's actually new content and new media that's being produced for it, and it's hugely like mainstream.
It's interesting because I think one of the things that people have said about Cyberpunk, the new one, is that it's more Cyberpunk as an aesthetic than Cyberpunk as like an ideology, where it takes a lot of sort of what the surface level things that the Cyberpunk genre addresses, right? That sort of hyper consumerist, that really like sort of capitalism run amok energy, and it has that, but it doesn't actually feel like it has nearly as much in terms of like political messaging when you actually play through the game. That it doesn't actually feel like it's positioned in a particularly radical political stance, and the marketing for the game was like pretty sort of edgy in a way that people were talking about like being potentially one of those games that appeals to let's just call the less ideal like demographic of gamers, the less ideal subset that's can be kind of terrible. So but it's interesting. I think one of the reasons why I like playing it right now, because normally I don't get games while they're new. First off, the reason why I'm playing it is because Eliza got it for me.
The infamous Eliza.
Yeah, which I'll be mentioning in the shout out at the end. But so that's somebody who deserves a big thank you.
Which she gets every week.
Yeah. And the other reason is that I think it really is part of that sort of like cultural conversation right now where just a lot of people are talking about it. It feels like there's stuff to say.
Right.
Like I was playing it and then I saw my cousin like boot it up on Steam at the same time, and I could just see like people that like I barely know in my like Steam friends list who are like playing Cyberpunk all the time. And so, you know, there's a lot going on that front. And I have other like friends that I know who don't play video games at all who are like, oh, I heard this about Cyberpunk.
Which is ironic considering we're an Injustice channel where the game probably peaked a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And the greatest popularity of a channel was probably 4 years ago. It's interesting, right? It's a huge contrast. This is like a Q&A that's themed on injustice, but really it's about gaming and just whatever else we want to talk about.
Pretty fun game, though. I don't know if I got anything else to say. We talked, I think, maybe too long about Cyberpunk, but
yeah,
we're where we are now. No going back. We can't edit this afterwards.
Well,
it's physically impossible.
Yeah,
but we can't edit audio.
Does that mean we should bring up a question from before? Or, sorry, that was maybe later on, that is probably relevant now?
Which one are you looking for?
I'm thinking about, I guess in general, where there was a comment that was sort of complimentary. And I think it was from Shubham, Sahoo?
Yeah.
And they said, even though I'm a complete newbie and beginner at the game, I found this channel through a thread and I'm loving this thoroughly. More power to you guys. So it's interesting to me because the thoughts I had when I was pulling this comment from one of the videos is that it still amazes me that we're still finding an audience. So the game started 4 or 5 years ago, something like that.
Yeah.
We've been doing this from almost the beginning. Peak engagement with viewers was probably within the first year.
I think at least 7 years ago, actually.
Has it been that? Oh, geez.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I guess so.
At least.
All right, never mind. I'm just seriously, I'm totally losing track of time. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. And so it definitely peaked a long time ago. If our views or ad revenue is anything to go by, and so it's really interesting to me because the fact that there's not only new players coming. I mean that's going to happen, right? You're going to have a game if it's available in the store, if it has some sort of connection to ongoing media, like Injustice. I mean, the contrast to that is Star Wars, right? Like, so when there were still new Star Wars movies coming out with the original trilogy, there's a huge amount of attention, a huge amount of sort of engagement. And then when you had the toys, still, even though there weren't movies, I think when was Return of the Jedi? 80,
I have no clue.
80. I want to say 83. But there was a huge gap between that and the first movie, right? Yeah. So what kept it going was fan fiction and people writing in the extended universe. And so there isn't that really... Injustice has it from the comics. Nothing is happening in the game, but there's still people coming to it and engaging with it in a way that they're seeking out other media. And I had this... We talked about this right before we started filming this, that to me, this kind of engagement where you're seeking out people to talk about it with, is that the right way to phrase it? To talk about it with and to watch videos about it and that kind of stuff is a level of engagement that is akin to watching the extras on a DVD or Blu-ray. And that's the part that surprised me. It doesn't surprise me that people are finding it. It surprised me that people are finding it and still wanting to engage with it in a way where it's meaningful. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Like, if that makes sense. So that I thought that was. I mean, obviously, thank you very much, Shubham. That it's very complimentary, but it made me very nostalgic too. It made me think a lot about how long we've been doing this. Clearly, not thinking enough to figure out how.
I might know how to pronounce that name. Actually, I might be wrong, but in The Circle, which was like this reality TV show on Netflix, it was Shubham. Oh, Shubham. There was somebody with that name.
Ah, okay, there you go. So thank you very much, Shubham, and it's again along those lines. Like it's interesting to me because we're sort of in uncharted territories. It's 7 years is a long time, but we're talking about mobile games and how long, what kind of lifespan a mobile game has, and most mobile games are really dead. Like after there's a few sort of significant exceptions.
They sort of go one way or the other, where they have incredible longevity, or a lot of them tend to sort of fizzle.
Like what happened to Angry Birds? Is that still a game? Is that still a
Angry
thing?
Birds 2 is the thing. They're still doing stuff, I think. They had a movie.
Yeah.
Right? So I think they're probably still doing pretty well, I'd say.
It is interesting to me. I just wonder where we're going to be. I mean, people have been predicting the end of Injustice for a long time, and I guess you could mark it by the lack of updates. Yeah. But the fact that they're still paying for the servers so that we can play online, and they have multiplayer season rewards, and they're making adjustments in their new packs in the last 3 weeks. There have been Nth Metal packs that didn't exist before in that kind of form, like the celebration packs. It tells me that there's still stuff going on behind the scenes, but not in a way that most people want to see.
There's still some amount of work being put into the game, which is good.
Yeah, so it's interesting to
me.
The
lights are still on. There's still somebody holding a candle for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there we go. Our next comment that we're going to talk about a little bit is a couple weeks ago, I think at least 2 weeks ago, or at least 3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago, yeah.
We talked about multitasking, and how multitasking wasn't really a thing. And so Apocalypse, in responding to that, says, multitasking, in one of my business textbooks, was defined as the ability to efficiently switch between tasks. Further along in the paragraph, it explained that doing multiple tasks at once is largely inefficient and is nigh impossible.
Did you ever hear Robin Williams singing Fire if he were Elmer Fudd?
No.
Romeo and Juliet.
I don't even know the song.
And Delilah.
I don't even know the song. I do know Robin Williams. But yeah, so multitasking.
All right, so it's an interesting because in my mind I was thinking of multitasking with the connotation that it was not just doing lots of things at the same time, but doing things in a way that was more efficient than doing them separately. Mm-hmm. And I did a bit of a dive after this comment, right? That there's different sort of things or sort of definitions, working definitions, and one of them that I found, and I'll put the links in the description, that performing 2 or more tasks simultaneously is multitasking. Switching back and forth from one thing to another also counts as multitasking, and performing a number of tasks in rapid succession also counts.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because once I started looking at it, so multitasking is not just one thing, but that all sort of forms of multitasking is a bit of a mess. And I guess there used to be some sort of, I don't know, do I want to say like cachet associated with the idea that somehow your brain was wired well enough that you could jump from one thing to another and do it so efficiently that you could get more than one thing done at once, to the point that you're better off than if you'd paid attention to one thing at a time.
Yeah, that like for some reason like a task is only using like 60% of your brain power or something, where it would use somebody else's 100%. So you're diverting that extra 40 to doing something else.
Right. So what I read was that when you do 2 things at once, it does things to your brain, and it affects your short-term memory. It can increase anxiety. It limits your ability to think creatively, because I guess when you're not as focused on the one thing, you're doing so many things, right? In terms of using your capacity, that you have less room to play around with ideas in your head that don't have to do with the specific task. And here's the key to me. It stops, the way they phrased it was, it stops you from getting into a state of flow. And I see this, like I know this, like there's certain moments where when you're really into something,
yeah,
and it's almost like everything else drops away, and it's like when you finally accelerate enough and you've picked up speed, and it's like everything just goes by like nothing.
Yeah.
Faster than that, more like
getting into the zone.
Yeah. And that you're also more likely to make mistakes and be less productive. Mm-hmm. And that when you switch, so that's just doing 2 things at once, but when you switch, it actually cuts down on your productivity, because it takes a certain amount of processing, like brain capacity, to sort of reset yourself and start the new task.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. But we still do it. That's the most interesting part to me, right? That we still, despite maybe knowing rationally and objectively, to, I guess as best as we can know something like this objectively when everybody performs stuff differently, is that we believe that it costs us, but we still do it. Mm-hmm. Right? We'll watch a show, check our email, read a book, listen to the radio, all of these things all at once.
Yeah. And you end up basically only being able to focus on one task at a time, and the more you split your attention, the worse you do at any individual task, even while you're focusing on it. Yeah, interesting stuff. Yeah, so multitasking, it's depending on how you define it, it's not like fake, right? It just
people do it
good.
Yeah, and people do it badly. So the implication that it's somehow that when people say, "Oh, I'm multitasking a lot," like it's more that implied the
implied value
connotation
of
is that they're good at it. Being good at multitasking doesn't exist, except as in being not as bad as other people. but is it single tasking? Monotasking is actually better for the task and probably for you too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting.
So there we go. Our next comment comes from Fabio, and they say, have you guys ever got into a beef with Injustice's subreddit? I ask because of their strict and cold hand towards glitches, which isn't really nearly as bad as hacking.
So the image I've got from cold hand is that it's like, you know, when you're warm and somebody sticks a hand on you cold and you like shiver away from it.
Yeah.
Like that's, I'm it doesn't feel like it's like a mixed metaphor. It doesn't feel like that's what's actually intended.
Maybe.
Right? Like
it could be. I don't know.
Like, you know, somebody touches you with a cold hand and it's really uncomfortable.
Yeah. That was a fun noise to come out of your mouth.
Yeah. So, what was the point? So it's interesting because no, we have not actually. And one of the moderators is Devlin16, whose list of breakthrough we linked to because they were good enough to lay it out for everybody. We've never actually had problems, and Devlin16 has actually specifically come out and said to us that they appreciate us for being respectful towards the subreddit. Because so here's the thing. I mean, back in the day, in the Wild Wild West, when Injustice was like Minecraft and everybody was creating their own Injustice channel, there were like dozens, right?
Yeah.
Of people doing Injustice videos, and there was almost a separation, you know, of the Venn diagram. People who did Injustice videos for play, and then the people who did Injustice videos for cheating.
Yeah.
There's almost no overlap, and I feel like we were the small number of people who were talking about not just play but strategy.
Maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure about that.
It felt like it because at least that's the impression I got from going on the subreddit, right? That when people were talking about different channels that did Injustice, that there was a number that wanted to go totally legitimate, talking about strategy, talking about collecting, and then some that were I guess it's respecting or acknowledging and recognizing where you're having the conversation.
Yeah, and I think the thing about it is, no matter how you feel about glitching, I think it makes sense to have spaces that aren't for that. And I think it's better to have some spaces that aren't for that, right?
Yeah, it makes clear the conversation you're having,
if you're trying to have conversations about achievements and collecting stuff and, you know, your experience of play, I think if you're using 0 glitches versus using a bunch of glitches versus just using the challenge reset, all of those sort of ways that you're playing are going to end up with you having very different sort of experiences with the game. Your relationship to the game is not going to be the same.
Right.
And it makes sense to have, you know, places where you're only having those conversations that are based off of people being like, maybe you feel more of a sense of pride when you haven't used any glitches, when you know that every single thing in your account has been earned in the way that the developers intended. Maybe there's a sense of fairness, right, where it's frustrating to talk about your achievements and then somebody who just glitches comes in and says, oh, that's so easy. I don't even know that, you know, I don't know why this took you so long. All I had to do was cheat and it only took me a few minutes. And so there's sort of a lot of reasons why you'd want a space that's separate from it. And then there's also that sort of potentially like moral stance that is exclusionary of having people who do glitch participate in your space, even if they come to you on your terms. Right. And so I think that's the good thing about the subreddit, which is that it's a space for people who don't use glitches, or it's a space for not talking about glitches.
Right.
But it's not exclusionary to people who use glitches. It's just, you know, that's not a topic of discussion within the subreddit, which I think is totally fair.
Right.
I think it's actually a good way of doing
it makes sense. It keeps the conversations cleaner, then they're less likely to get derailed. And I think that if you're going to make the separation, I mean, I'll acknowledge this now. The distinction that we make between hacking and cheating is a subtler one than the one that we make between cheating and not cheating.
Yeah.
So it's becomes easier to not only define for the people coming in, but to police it.
Yeah.
So then, you know, I've had experience moderating forums before, and, you know, it gets to be really tedious when a bunch of your work ends up being, instead of participating in the forum, is to police what people do.
Yeah.
So I totally get that. I understand why. I think that's probably why it's easier for us too, because let's face it, I mean, the when was the last time there was actually a new glitch?
Oh, it's been a long time.
Yeah. So I think we've transitioned, I want to say effectively, but it's hard to know because the game's on sort of the downside, right? It's not at its peak interest. That it's probably a bigger part of our audience is going to be the maybe not, because these Q&As don't get the number of views, but they do get the most engagement. And if anything, I mean, the ad revenue is almost nothing, but we get as much ad revenue for this sort of almost not like a little bit of gameplay, a little bit of rambling stuff as we do for our regular updates, which is interesting. So,
but yeah, so the long and short of it, we've never run into any difficulties, and I think it's makes sense because I think we have a lot of respect for what they do, and I think in general, I can't speak for them, but I think anybody who is not making more work for them and who is, you know, making an active effort to contribute to the community is probably somebody that they don't mind unless they have some sort of moral objection to what we're doing.
And I think part of it too is that we still have something to contribute. I mean, our expertise isn't just in glitches.
Yeah.
That I think that's important too, right? I mean, I've gotten into some discussions where people are talking about what happens, and I think there's something to be said about the theoretical stuff, and something to be said about having, in weightlifting, you call it time under the bar. Yeah. And that because we put in the time just grinding, that there's stuff that we don't know everything, but there's stuff we understand and know about the game that you wouldn't be able to get just from reading about it.
We are definitely not the most knowledgeable people about this mobile game, but we are among them. We are in a high percentile.
Something like that, yeah.
If you look at everybody who's played the game, we're up there in number of hours put in and amount that we know about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there we go. Our next question comes from Ibali Derpface, or I guess this is just a comment. See, that's the difficulty with calling it a Q&A, is sometimes it's not a Q. But they say, since I've started the series of watching your weekly videos, I don't think I have missed once. Also, I've watched your Survivor completion video like 4 times. It's good, solid info, and I really think you guys should remake it if you want. Thanks for the vids, guys.
Yeah, appreciate it. That's a very nice compliment. Mm-hmm. And I think that probably is one of our most popular videos.
Consistently performing videos, for sure.
Yeah, it's what you'd call, if you were in the book industry, you'd call it a long tail.
Yeah.
So unlike other popular videos that peaked and then almost nobody watches them.
Yeah.
We've got some pretty good. It's probably one of our ongoing most popular videos.
Yeah. And so I think the problem is that when we did it, it was a time where Survivor was something that could be completed. And now it's not.
Is it not? It's just...
Some people say, right, that there's stages that are impossible.
Well, that you have to get random, or sometimes you get different characters, or you get different gear loadouts on them. And that certain combinations are not possible, but if you get to that point and you're lucky enough to get the right combination...
I guess so.
That it's completable.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of work. And I think, I mean... If we were to do something, what we might do is more sort of general tips and tricks videos along those same lines, right? Yeah. Where it would be sort of like our best tips for Survivor. But I think the completion aspect of it might just be more work than it's worth at this point.
I mean, we're at a different stage in our life too, right? So back then it was Survivor was there. We hadn't completed it. It was a bit of a challenge. And even though Survivor's changed and we haven't completed the new Survivor, I feel like there's less drive to do it, especially with that big time commitment you're talking about, where in order to film, I think that video is almost an hour. And I know we do these Q&As that are an hour long, but we don't have the time to commit to playing it over and over again like we did before.
Yeah.
To get the right combination to film it and not blow an hour of play. I mean, it'll be longer now too, right? Because the later stages the fights last longer. Mm-hmm. Like even when you win, it's impossible to really win them quickly.
Yeah.
So it makes it, chances are it's not going to happen. Maybe if I retire and this was all I was going to do, but I don't think I'm going to retire enough before they shut the servers down on Injustice.
Or at least not before our channel dies.
Yeah, there's that too. I mean, I gotta tell you, this whole thing has lasted. It's been a great ride, but this whole thing has lasted a lot longer than I thought it would.
Me too.
And I think I really do want to thank our patrons on Patreon for that, because part of the times, sometimes when things were slow enough that I thought about stopping, that I felt that I owed our patrons something, like a certain obligation
and
to...
even more than that, just knowing that there are people who engage with us that strongly, right? And like knowing that there is that demographic there, and then being able to extrapolate, was like, well, for every patron, maybe there's another person who likes us just as much, but doesn't have the financial means to support us, right?
Yeah.
And it's just that sort of the way that you can extrapolate to imagine sort of what your audience looks like and people. And we get quite a lot of nice comments. I mean, we have a lot of nice comments even just in this video of people just saying quite kind things to us and indicating that they enjoy our stuff, which really does make it worthwhile.
Yeah, and I feel like it's like a lot of other maybe not habits, but things that you fit into your life that once you give it up. The analogy that in my mind is like to exercise, right?
Yeah.
Like once you stop doing it, once you find an excuse to skip something in your regular routine, then it becomes easy to just make another excuse, and before you know it, you're done. And that's why those behavioral changes are so hard.
Yeah.
And this is sort of like that, because what we've done is we've built into our schedule the time it takes to do a recap, the time it takes to do our Q&A every week. And
outside of exams or something like that, or really specific scenarios, we don't really take breaks from that.
Right. And even when you do have exams, I try to fill it in with some sort of reasonable content, like not just content for the sake of taking up electrons on the internet, but to something that was interesting to me. It's just that started with Survivor, so I guess the answer is no. I don't think we're going to do it. And the fact that we're still even doing any content sometimes feels like a real surprise.
Yeah. There we go. Our next question comes from Olisa Oz, and they say, I reckon Shazam, and then in brackets Prime, is still really good with the right teammate. Suicide Squad Harley Quinn, and then in brackets Tantu Totem, gives him full bars, and he does his thing, and when the time expires, you can tag Harley Quinn and reset the process. Basically, you'll have 2 Tantu Totems in one team, legally.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, right? Like, when you look at the Justice League team like this is what it's like to have 2.5 Tantu Totems legally, right? Where New 52 Wonder Woman's giving Man of Steel's Superman bars of power over and over again with her Tantu Totem. I mean, Shazam could be... I mean, ideal world, if Shazam counted as a Justice League teammate, that would be great. Then I would totally bring Shazam in instead of Man of Steel. The problem is, Shazam could be as good as anybody else with Tantu Totem, but then you'd be sort of not making use of passive. And if you try to use Suicide Squad or Harley Quinn with her special 2 where you give your teammates power, you do that over and over. 1, it takes a bunch of time to do that where you're doing no damage.
Yeah.
2, if you happen to pick the wrong things sort of cycling through, then it not only eats up more time, but there's a chance that you lose your power if you use her dynamite. And it just takes longer. You're almost faster because... So not only would you have to do that first, you'd have to do his super, which takes a bunch of time for the animation, and then you'd have to really take advantage of it, I think, a few special 2s, right? Yeah. But if he had Tantu Totem, and he did his special 2 and did enough damage, he'd get his power back anyways, instead of having to rely on his passive for that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Like, it's definitely... If there's some way to work around that... The time that it takes to generate 3 bars of power for him, I would be tempted, but it seems like he's sort of his own thing, and trying to make him something else ends up being not nearly as much fun.
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea, though. I really like the idea, because Shazam used to be, like, not only was he used to be like not only a rare drop in the gold, but he used to be one of the top tier characters, right? Shazam, the first Darkseid, if you use them on a team, they would give you the most defense battles.
Yeah.
even though they had no synergy and they weren't that good, but their stats were just so high and they're so powerful. I would love to find a use for Shazam. I mean, really, in my mind, the best use for him would probably be still with Tanty Totem, because it would be hard to do much else with him.
Yeah. So there we go. So our next two comments are sort of related to each other. So the first one comes from Bar David Ben Atiya, and they say, do you guys know when Injustice 2 Superman will be back as a challenge character? And then our next one comes from PAG2DRXPY, and they say, great content, guys, enjoyed yet another video. Do you guys by any chance have like a schedule of order of challenge modes as well as online rewards, so I know when it's worth grinding and when to sit back? And so these questions are both related, and it's not a very long answer. We don't need to talk about this very long if we don't want to. Long and short of it, we don't. And you can tell when we talk about the last time a challenge was available in our weekly recaps that it jumps around wildly, right? Mm-hmm. We have no insight onto how they actually organize when things are back, because sometimes they come back in like a year, sometimes it's more than 2 years. I don't know what the shortest amount of time it's been, but it's probably been like a couple months, right? Like 6 months or something like that. Yeah. Although I'm not sure, I'd have to check that. But the important bit is that, well, it's clearly not following any kind of recognizable cycle, because every new character that comes in, it's not the same pattern where it's like we saw it this many months ago, right?
Right.
Which would indicate that it's on like a cycle that's just that big. It totally jumps around. So sometimes we haven't seen it in like forever. Sometimes we've seen it pretty recently, and it seems like there's no rhyme or reason to it. And unless there is some sort of pattern that's just too complicated for us to see, that you'd have to do some really complicated like statistical analysis on, and I cannot imagine that that's the formula that anybody at Injustice at Warner Brothers is using to determine what the next challenge character is. It just seems like it's almost random.
Yeah, and I mean, aside from with the only caveat, the only qualification being that, you know, when you got the pack the week before, that's really your only clue, and predicting a week ahead is not really
and
very much at all.
They've paired the Suicide Squad people together more than once.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at, because I've been tracking on our spreadsheet now for almost 2 years. We're getting close to 2 year mark, and I've tried to color code it in a way that I can pick up patterns, but I'm really not seeing something. There's a couple of, you know, the Suicide Squad you mentioned, right? So there was one point in 2019 in June where they were all three in a row. Then there was just Joker by himself to celebrate some sort of Joker movie, I think.
Yeah.
And then they brought them back in the summer just now, but split by a week. Yeah. And then they brought back Suicide Squad Harley Quinn again. So it feels like there's almost
there's sometimes together, sometimes for other events, and then sometimes not. But they've been together more than random chance, right? They were paired up together at a rate that is higher than just like a random number generator, like pulling one challenge at a time. So but there's no real consistency.
Yeah.
I honestly would be interested in knowing whoever at Warner Brothers or whatever group of people is deciding who to put in, what their system for it is, because it seems basically random.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It seems like, but it seems random, not computer random number generator random. It seems like random, like a guy picking names out of a hat, or being like, what feels right next week, and then looking at like a list and just being like, I'll put in one of those, it's been a while, type random,
mm-hmm.
right? So it doesn't feel like there's no rhyme or reason, but I doesn't seem like we're ever going to have a cycle. And if we do, it'll be so long before it establishes itself. It's entirely possible that, you know, at any week in the future, we're going to suddenly snap to a cycle. Right. And then all of a sudden it will be. But up until this point, we have not seen anything that resembles one. Yeah. So there we go. Our next question, or our next comment, comes from Sun Gaku, and they say, one of the chillest podcasts. I'm glad you guys are keeping the game alive. One of the greatest mobile games ever.
I just, while you're reading that question, I just took a look at the spreadsheet. The closest that we had a repeat was about a month and a half. And in February 2020, they had Batgirl, February 6th. And then March 26th, they had Batgirl again. And that was the closest there was. It was a break in a pattern that there was a run of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 challenges in a row that were the same, that were repeated from July 2019. And that was the closest we came to something. Sorry, it was an interesting question, and when you said a few things, it made me think a little bit more. Let's see.
Yeah, so there's little hints of repeating.
It almost feels like they were gonna start doing something, and then they just totally didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I don't know if we have too much to say. You put this comment in, so I don't know if you have any specific comments. Just something nice.
Chillest podcast.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I disagree. There's so many podcasts. I'm sure there's many that are much more chill than us. And I don't even feel particularly chill most of the time. I feel like we get riled up about politics like a moderate amount.
We do.
I wouldn't describe myself as chill, which I don't think is a bad thing. Right? It's not like if you're looking at the chill continuum and you want to be chill or not chill, I think being chill is usually the goal.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I would say I'm not chill, but I probably would not describe myself as particularly chill.
Yeah. So that actually leads into another question from later.
Yeah?
Do you want to jump?
Sure. So this is from Mohammed. We'll have to get to some stuff next week because I spent too much time talking about Cyberpunk. So Mohammed says, "Hey guys, love your videos. Have you guys considered of putting your political talk towards the end rather than the beginning? I'm not too big into politics, and it would be nice to listen to the gaming stuff first. Not that I don't care about your political views, I just came here for gaming discussion, not politics. LOL. No hate, by the way, just a suggestion. Hope you stay safe."
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's a nice way to ask it, too.
Yeah.
And
I think everybody should be into politics, but I recognize that this is probably not the forum to make people
and maybe they are. Maybe they're in politics at a different place, and this is the space they come to for something different, right?
Yeah.
And that's totally fair. I guess the what's happening part that sometimes that we get into at the beginning is a lot less structured. So it's easier, to me it feels like it's easier to have the structured questions at the end where, it helps pull us back into it when we've wandered off a little bit in the weeds, and it doesn't end up, it ends up, it's harder to forget stuff when we have the questions that tie us back to the idea that we were talking about.
Yeah. And I think, the problem is that we really just, the way that this works for us, we just talk about whatever we want pretty much whenever. Yeah. And if it's good enough for specific people, in terms of their enjoyment of it, that they want to listen, then that's great. And we don't do a lot of tailoring to specific audience.
We don't even do much editing at all. This is a one-time this is the first pass in the can,
Yeah, so
one and done.
If it's easier, if it makes sense for us to do that, if we have political comments, for example, we can actually make an effort to put those at the end. And I think, having them spaced out, especially if we do talk about politics at the beginning, makes sense. But as a general rule, if we just want to say stuff about politics, that is almost certainly going to go at the beginning because we don't know how long that's going to take and we want to sort of give that stuff the space to breathe. But we do appreciate the feedback and we will organize accordingly.
For all the times that when somebody made a suggestion and we said we're never going to do that, I can... It'll take me more than one hand to count the number of times we've actually gone ahead and done that later.
Yeah.
Because the idea is now in our head and it sort of stews a little bit and percolates and ends up coming out as a different... we used to say that we wouldn't do updates on a different day because of my work schedule.
And then we just totally did.
And we totally did. We just found a way and it happened. It was because people had suggested and, I was totally resistant to it.
They suggested it. It was a good idea. It just took us a little more time to realize that it was a good idea than somebody else who was less attached to our schedule.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Let nobody say that we've never admitted we were wrong because we are wrong frequently.
Lots.
Yeah. So we are done with the footage. The interesting thing is I've just spent, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, some time editing together all of these end sequences where I do the shoutouts. And I've recognized how consistent my speech pattern is across all of the shoutouts. And so I feel weirdly aware of it now.
Oh, self-conscious.
I say something along the lines of, we got some people we like to say some stuff to, is a phrase that I picked up in like the last half year or so that I really enjoyed and I've used to great effect. And then I'll say something like, so first off, a quick shout out to, and it's almost always that exact phrasing.
With the same tone and the rhythm. There's a word for that, prosody, I think.
Yeah.
The same, it just,
Not exactly the same, but it's a very comfortable pattern that I've fallen into. And being aware of it, I'm coming to it now, thinking of a different way to say it. And I really just want to say, first off, a quick shout out. And I don't know if there's a better way. So I'm going to give a shout out today to Eliza, Merry Christmas, Caton, who I've only recently realized, like just when writing this right before the video, that I'm like not sure if or why she celebrates Christmas because she's Jewish, but I know that she has a Christmas tree in her home. So I think after this, I'm going to have to ask Eliza about what her relationship to Christmas is, because we're exchanging Christmas gifts.
Right.
But I also know that she celebrates Hanukkah. So,
but Christmas is less a religious holiday than it's become a commercial one now.
I guess so.
And it's celebrated by atheists and Christians and other religions alike because it's more of a cultural thing in North America and I guess other countries, not just North America, but my experience.
Yeah, I don't know why. It's just the way that it works in my brain that if you're like celebrating a different holiday that is religious, like you only get one, you don't get to double dip. But I know that's not true, so I guess I'll follow up. And this shout out has been brought to you by the generous gift of a copy of Cyberpunk 2077, which first 15 minutes of the video can attest to I'm enjoying thoroughly.
Nice.
And we'd also like to give a huge thank you to everybody who is supporting us on Patreon.
That would be Console Peasant and Edwoon supporting us at the top tier last word, Mohammed Albshaiti at the Your Message Here tier, Shawn Farrell, Daniel Simonson, Aaron Maule, Michael DeVries, Brandon C., Irvin Ruiz, and Eddydoo, who support us on the credited level, and Chris Wolf, Scarlet Danny, Awesome Gamer 241, Pavu RS, Gavin Malott, and Isfar E at the gratitude level.
There we go. Thank you all so much for your support, and thanks so much to everybody for watching. We'll see you next time.
Komoda.